I thought that moving was a chance to save our relationship. But when I told him about it, he turned into a monster. And then it turned out that I wasn't the first victim. I lived with Tom, my boyfriend, for over 6 years, and in many ways, those years felt like a blur that began before I had even fully caught my breath. I was 31 when we met, still finding my footing in the world, trying to balance the quiet grief of past heartbreaks with the hope that maybe love could still surprise me, while Tom at 42 seemed confident, established, and entirely sure of what he wanted. From the very beginning, everything with him developed so quickly that it almost felt like being swept away by a current too strong to resist. We moved in together within a few months, merged our lives like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I, caught up in the rush of something that finally felt solid, didn't stop to question how fast everything was moving. It wasn't that I ignored the red flags, it was more that I was too busy trying to believe in the version of life he offered, structured, adult, filled with plans and routines that made me feel like I was finally doing something right. Looking back now, I realize how quickly I stopped asking myself what I wanted, how easily I let my needs fall behind in the name of harmony, of stability, of not wanting to lose something that seemed good enough. But in the beginning it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like starting over. Tom had 2 children from a previous marriage, a son and a daughter who split their time between our house and their mothers, while I came into the relationship with just my old dog, Bandit, a quiet, graying retriever who had been with me through every major chapter of my adult life. Despite the differences in our lives before we met, we gradually built something that resembled a shared rhythm, a sort of organized chaos that blended school pickups, work deadlines, dog walks, and quiet evenings into a routine that felt predictable, if not perfect. Last year, in a moment that felt hopeful and almost symbolic, we got another puppy, something new, something that was ours together, and the days that followed were full of muddy paws, early morning barking, and the kind of messy joy that comes from starting something fresh. Bandit slowed down while the puppy grew wild and curious, and the kids adjusted, laughing at the new dog's clumsy zoom eyes and helping with food and walks. From the outside, everything looked stable, almost idyllic in a domestic kind of way, and for a while, I let myself believe that we had finally found the balance we needed. I worked from 9 to 6 every day, grinding through long hours in an office that often left me drained by the time I got home, while Tom, whose work was inconsistent and often dependent on freelance gigs or short-term contracts, could stay at home for weeks at a time without much to do. At first, I told myself it was just a rough patch, that his field was unpredictable and that things would even out eventually, but as time went on, it became clear that the imbalance was no longer temporary, it had become the norm. Somehow, without meaning to, I had taken on everything. The finances, the household chores, the errands, the vet appointments, and even managing the children's schedules when they came to visit. I was the one who made sure dinner was ready, that homework was checked, that the fridge was stocked and the laundry folded, and though I never wanted to keep score, there were nights when I'd lie awake counting all the ways I was carrying the weight of a life we were supposed to be building together. He thanked me sometimes, sure, but never with the kind of awareness that showed he truly saw what it was costing me. I told myself this was what love looked like: sacrifice, patience, support, but deep down, a quiet resentment was beginning to take root. He never liked to talk about the relationship, and every time I tried to open up a conversation about the future, about how I was feeling, or even just to ask where we were headed, it was like hitting a wall that got colder with every word. Sometimes he would ignore me completely, staring at his phone or suddenly getting up to do something else, acting as if my words hadn't been spoken at all. Other times he would scold me, his tone sharp and defensive, accusing me of being too emotional, too needy, or of creating problems where none existed. He would say things like, "Can't you just be happy with what we have?" Or, "Why do you always need to complicate things?" And it made me feel like wanting clarity, wanting to be seen and heard in the relationship, was some kind of weakness. Slowly I stopped bringing it up, not because I had found peace in silence, but because I had learned that speaking my truth only led to conflict or dismissal. It was easier to swallow my doubts than to face the cold reaction I had come to expect. Even though each time I stayed quiet, I felt myself disappearing just a little more. Over time, without even realizing it was happening at first, I began to isolate myself from the people who once made me feel grounded. My friends, my family, the voices that used to remind me of who I was before everything became so tangled and heavy. It started with small things: missed calls I didn't return, plans I quietly declined, messages I read and never answered, until eventually I found myself living in a world that revolved entirely around Tom and the life I was trying to hold together for both of us. I became a quieter version of myself, a shadow who went through the motions but rarely spoke up, rarely asked for anything, afraid that my needs would only be met with silence or frustration. All I ever wanted was to build something lasting, to be a wife, a mother, to have the kind of home filled with certainty and warmth that I had spent my whole life imagining. But while I was carrying the vision of a future in my heart, Tom seemed perfectly content to remain just a boyfriend, floating in a space where responsibility could always be pushed aside and real commitment could be endlessly postponed. I kept hoping that if I just held on a little longer, if I just proved how much I was willing to give, he would meet me where I was. But the longer I waited, the more I realized he was never planning to. One day, in the middle of folding laundry and listening to the quiet hum of a life that no longer felt like my own, it hit me with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. If something didn't change and change soon, I was going to completely drown in this role I had built around him, a role that demanded everything from me and gave nothing back. I looked at my life and barely recognized myself, and that realization settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't carry any longer. Around that same time, my sister told me she was moving out of her apartment, a small but bright space not far from where we grew up, and something in me clicked. Without overthinking, without second-guessing, I decided I would take her apartment and move out. It wasn't a grand plan or a dramatic escape, it was simply a line in the sand, the first real step toward reclaiming the person I used to be before I made myself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort zone. It felt terrifying, yes, but for the first time in years, it also felt like breathing. At first, I told myself I would leave quietly, that it would be easier for both of us if I packed my things while he was away, left a letter explaining everything, and simply disappeared from the space we once shared without having to endure the confrontation I had spent years avoiding. I imagined slipping out like a ghost, avoiding his defensiveness, his blank stares, his ability to make me feel like my feelings were too much or not enough. But the more I sat with that plan, the more I realized that after everything I had given, after all the silence I had swallowed, I deserved more than just a quiet exit. I deserved to say the truth out loud, to speak from the part of me that had stayed hidden for far too long. I didn't need to scream or accuse, I just needed to be heard. I needed to look him in the eye and tell him how exhausted I was, how small I had become, how lonely it felt to be in love with someone who never met me halfway. And more than anything, I needed to remind myself that my voice still mattered even if it shook. I got everything ready in the quiet, methodical way that had come to define so much of my life with him, cleaning the apartment until every surface felt like it belonged to someone who cared, cooking one of his favorite meals not out of guilt, but because I wanted this to be honest and whole, not bitter or cruel. I wrote a letter too, not because I was going to leave it behind, but because I needed to organize my thoughts, to give shape to everything that had been building inside me for months, maybe even years. When Tom came home from work, walking through the door with the same tired expression and barely a glance in my direction, I stood in the middle of the kitchen, heart pounding, and asked him to sit down so we could talk. There was no rage in my voice, no dramatic tone, just a calm steadiness that came from finally knowing what I had to do. He raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by my seriousness, but he sat down, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't about to ask for something, I was about to reclaim something I had nearly forgotten was mine. As soon as I began to read the letter, my voice trembling but steady enough to get the first few words out, Tom's expression shifted into something I had never seen before, sharp, violent, and unrecognizable. Without warning, he lunged forward, snatched the paper out of my hands and tore it into pieces right in front of me, the sound of it ripping louder than anything I was able to say. Before I could even process what was happening, he spat in my face with a rage that stunned me into silence, and the words that followed were like knives. He called me garbage, useless, disgusting, every cruel thing he could throw in my direction without flinching. Then, as if the emotional attack wasn't enough, he crossed a line I never thought he would. He started beating me. His fists were sudden, brutal, and came without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting all along for the moment when my strength finally threatened the control he thought he had over me. Every blow shattered not only my body, but every illusion I had held about who he was, and in those terrifying seconds, I realized that the man I had loved, the life I had built around him, had been nothing more than a cage disguised as comfort. He grabbed me by the hair so violently that I could feel the sharp burn of each strand tearing at my scalp, yanking me to the floor as if I were nothing more than an object in his way, and then the fists came, hard, fast, full of fury, landing against my ribs, my arms, wherever his rage could find a target. When I tried to curl into myself, to shield the most fragile parts of me, he began to kick, each blow feeling like it might split me in two, and I remember the taste of blood in my mouth before I even realized I was bleeding. I had no strength left to resist, no energy to scream or fight back. All I could do was survive the seconds, praying they would end. And in the chaos, in the horror of that moment, my old dog Bandit tried to protect me, throwing himself between us with a loyalty only animals seem capable of, barking, growling, trying to stop something he didn't understand but knew was wrong. I heard him yelp, one sharp, heartbreaking sound, and when I saw him stumble back, dazed and hurt, something inside me broke completely. This wasn't just violence. This was a man destroying everything I loved without hesitation, and the fear I felt then was not just for myself, but for the life I needed to escape with. Around 3 in the morning, when Tom finally passed out on the couch, the weight of his rage replaced by the deep, careless sleep of someone who didn't think twice about what he had done, I quietly gathered the strength I had left, slipped on a hoodie to cover the bruises, and took both dogs, Bandit, still limping slightly, and the puppy who clung to me with wide, uncertain eyes. I didn't stop to pack anything else, didn't even look back at the home that had turned into a prison, because I knew if I hesitated for even a second, I might not leave at all. My sister was staying at her boyfriend's place that night, which meant her apartment was empty, quiet, and waiting, and I still had the spare key she had given me months ago for emergencies. I unlocked the door with shaking hands, stepped inside with the dogs close behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, closed a door behind me that felt safe. There were no lights on, no voices, no need to explain myself, and as I sank to the floor in the dim hallway with the dogs pressed against me, I finally let the tears come, not because I was still afraid but because I had survived. For 2 weeks, I couldn't find the strength to tell anyone what had happened, not my sister, not my closest friends, not even the quiet corners of the internet where people spill their truths to strangers. I stayed in that apartment, moving through the days like a ghost, tending to the bruises that bloomed across my body like reminders I couldn't escape, wincing every time I looked in the mirror and barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. I was ashamed that I had stayed for so long, that I had ignored the signs, that I had given so much of myself to someone who had shown me nothing but contempt in the end. Every time I thought about speaking up, something inside me tightened, a knot of guilt and fear and humiliation that whispered maybe it was my fault, maybe I had pushed too hard, maybe I had deserved it somehow. I knew logically that none of that was true, but shame is irrational and loud, and for a while, it drowned out everything else. I felt broken in a way I didn't know how to name, not just physically but spiritually, as if the person I had been before all of this had vanished and I didn't know how to bring her back. So I stayed quiet, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket and a cage all at once. But when I finally worked up the courage to call his ex-wife, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear, I wasn't prepared for the way her words would hit me like ice against my skin. I had called her out of desperation, not even fully knowing what I was looking for, validation, understanding, maybe just someone who knew him like I did. And when she picked up and I haltingly began to explain what had happened, there was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, with a calmness that sent a chill through me, "I knew he would do this to you. He did it to me too." And just like that, everything inside me froze. The shock of it, the quiet finality in her voice, the certainty, all of it cracked something open that I had been holding together for too long. In that moment, all the denial, all the excuses I had made for him, all the hope that maybe this was a terrible one-time mistake, it shattered. I realized I hadn't just been unlucky. I had been part of a pattern, part of a cycle that had started long before me and would likely continue long after unless someone stopped it. And with those simple words, she gave me something I hadn't expected. The confirmation that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting, and most of all, I wasn't alone. It turned out that during their marriage he had beaten her repeatedly, not just behind closed doors but even in front of their children, and as she told me the details, her voice stayed steady, almost numb, like someone who had long since run out of room to grieve. She said she kept silent for years because she was terrified of being deported, afraid that speaking up would cost her everything, her home, her kids, her future, and so she endured it, carrying the pain alone while pretending, as so many of us do, that everything was fine. She told me there had been a moment when the violence became impossible to hide, when someone called the police and he was arrested, taken away in handcuffs while the kids watched from the stairs. But even then, with the bruises fresh and the fear still in her voice, she dropped the charges. She said she wasn't proud of it, but at the time she didn't think she had a choice. Listening to her, I realized how deep the damage he caused truly ran, how many lives he had touched with his cruelty, and how long he had been getting away with it. Her story didn't just echo mine, it deepened it, and it reminded me that silence only protects the abuser, never the ones trying to survive him. Then I decided, with a clarity that came not from anger but from something deeper and more resolute, that I would not be silent anymore. I had spent enough time shrinking myself, enough time letting fear and shame dictate my choices, and I knew that if I didn't speak now, if I didn't act, Tom would do to someone else exactly what he did to me, and worse. So I went to the police. I told them everything, step by step, bruise by bruise, word by word, even when my voice shook and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I collected every piece of evidence I had: photos, messages, the torn letter he ripped from my hands, the medical records, even my conversation with his ex-wife, and I handed it all over, determined to make it count. I filed the report, pushed through the paperwork, answered every uncomfortable question, and I swore to myself that I would see it through no matter how long it took. Because I refused to let him destroy another life like he destroyed mine. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm fighting back.